The chains on her wrists were too tight, but Ilara Voss refused to let anyone see her flinch. She was dragged through the great doors of Blackthorn Castle by 2 guards who gripped her arms so hard she knew there would be bruises by morning, if she lived that long to see one. The hall around her buzzed with whispers. Torches burned along stone walls that stretched higher than any building she had ever seen, and at the far end, on a throne carved from black wood, sat the man every soul in the kingdom feared. King Cade Ashgrove did not look up right away. He was writing something, a quill moving fast across a page, as if the woman being pulled toward him was not worth his full attention yet. That alone told Ilara everything about the kind of ruler he was. Cold, distant. A man who had built his throne on the fear of everyone beneath him. Alpha King, the lead guard said, bowing low. We caught the thief in the West Market. She was seen taking bread from the royal grain stores. Ilara's jaw tightened. I did not steal anything. The words came out sharper than she intended, and the hall went silent. No one spoke to the king that way. No one spoke at all unless spoken to first, and even then, most chose their words as if walking across thin ice. Cade finally lifted his eyes. They were a pale gray, the color of a storm about to break, and when they landed on her, Ilara felt something strange settle in her chest, something she could not name and did not have time to think about, because he was already rising from his throne. He was taller than she expected, broader too, with the kind of build that came from years of battle rather than years of comfort. A thin scar ran along his jaw, the only imperfection on an otherwise commanding face. He walked down the steps slowly, each footstep echoing through the silent hall, and stopped only when he stood directly in front of her. You dare raise your voice in my hall, he said. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of calm that was more frightening than shouting would have been. I dare tell the truth, Ilara answered, which is more than most people in this room seem willing to do. A ripple of shock passed through the gathered court. Someone gasped. A guard's hand moved toward his sword, as if expecting the king to give an order that would end her life on the spot. Cade tilted his head, studying her the way a hunter studies something unfamiliar in the woods, something that does not behave the way it is supposed to. Do you know what happens to people who steal from the crown? I imagine you would tell me even if I did not ask. Their hands are removed. Sometimes both, depending on my mood. Ilara's heart pounded, but she kept her chin lifted. She thought of her younger brother and sister waiting for her in their small home near the edge of the city, hungry, with nothing left in the cupboards because the harvest had failed and prices had tripled overnight. She thought of every unfair law this man had signed, every tax that crushed families like hers while his court dined on food stacked higher than any one person could eat in a lifetime. Then punish me, she said, but do not pretend it is justice. You sit up there in gold and silk while your people starve in the streets below your window. You call yourself a king, but a king protects his people. You only frighten them. That is not strength. That is a man too weak to earn respect any other way, so he takes it by force instead. The silence that followed was the kind that presses against the ears, thick and suffocating. Even the torches seemed to hold their breath. Ilara braced herself. She had said it. Whatever came next, at least the words were out, spoken to his face, not whispered behind closed doors like everyone else in the kingdom was too afraid to do. But nothing came next, not immediately. Cade stood completely still, staring at her as though she had struck him, though she had not moved an inch beyond the words themselves. His breathing changed, slow and uneven, and something flickered behind his gray eyes, something that looked almost like pain, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Then, without warning, without any command given, without any reason that made sense to anyone watching, the Alpha King of Blackthorn lowered himself to one knee before her. The entire hall gasped as one. A goblet slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the floor, the sound sharp in the stunned quiet. Guards exchanged confused glances, unsure whether to intervene, unsure whether this was some kind of trick meant to draw the thief in closer before punishment. Advisors near the throne went pale, whispering to one another behind raised hands. Ilara stared down at him, too shocked to speak. Cade knelt with his head bowed, one fist pressed against the stone floor, in the exact position a subject would take before a ruler, not the other way around. His shoulders were rigid, his whole body tense, as if he were fighting against his own actions and losing. "Get up," Ilara whispered, though she was not entirely sure why she said it. Something about seeing the most feared man in the kingdom kneeling before a woman in chains felt deeply wrong, dangerous even, though she could not explain why the wrongness frightened her more than his earlier threats had. Cade did not move. His hands trembled slightly against the floor, something no one in that hall had likely ever witnessed from him before. "My king," one of the guards said carefully, stepping forward. "Shall we take her to the dungeon?" Still, Cade said nothing. He remained kneeling, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on the ground as though staring at it hard enough might undo what had just happened. Finally, after what felt like an eternity stretched thin across the silent hall, he rose. But he did not look like a man who had simply lost his balance or stumbled by accident. He looked like a man who had been forced into something against his own will, and the fury in his eyes when he straightened was not directed at Ilara at all. It was directed inward. "Release her," he said, his voice tight. The guard hesitated. "My king, the theft." "I said, release her." The command cracked through the hall like thunder, and this time, no one dared question it. The chains around Ilara's wrists were unlocked at once, and she rubbed the raw skin beneath them, still trying to understand what had just happened, still trying to understand why the king who had just threatened to remove her hands was now staring at her as if she held some kind of power over him. "Take her to the East Wing," Cade said to a nearby servant, a young woman named Grace who kept her eyes down as she stepped forward. "See that she has food, clean clothes, and a room. She is not to be harmed." "Wait," Ilara said, finding her voice again. "I am not going anywhere with you. I have a brother and sister at home who need me. I did not ask for any of this." Cade's eyes met hers again, and this time there was something almost pleading in them, buried beneath the iron control he clearly fought hard to maintain. "You are not a prisoner," he said quietly, quiet enough that only she could hear it. "But you cannot go home. Not yet. Not until I understand what just happened here." "And what exactly happened here?" "I do not know," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice surprised her more than anything else that had occurred in the last few minutes. "But I intend to find out. Until then, your family will be provided for. Food will be sent to your home today. No harm will come to them." Ilara studied his face, searching for the trick she was certain must be hiding somewhere in his words. Kings did not kneel. Kings did not admit confusion in front of their entire court. Kings certainly did not offer kindness to women who had just publicly insulted them in front of every noble in the land. And yet here he stood, offering exactly that. "Why should I trust anything you say?" she asked. "You should not," Cade answered simply. "Not yet, but I am asking you to stay regardless." Grace, the young servant, stepped closer and gently touched Ilara's arm. "Please," she whispered, "come with me. It is safer this way, I promise." Ilara looked around the hall one last time, at the shocked faces of nobles who clearly had never seen their king behave this way, at the guards who kept glancing between her and Cade as though trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces, and at Cade himself, who stood watching her with an intensity that made her skin feel warm despite the cold stone floor beneath her bare feet. She did not understand what had happened. She did not understand why the most ruthless ruler in the land had knelt before her instead of ordering her hands removed as he had threatened only moments earlier. But some instinct, buried deep beneath her fear and her anger, told her that walking away now would mean never learning the truth. And more than that, her siblings needed food that she alone could not provide. If this strange, impossible offer meant they would eat tonight, She could not simply refuse out of pride. "Fine," she said finally. "I will stay, but only until I understand what game you are playing." "It is not a game," Cade said, and something in his voice made her almost believe him. As Grace led her from the hall, Ilara glanced back one final time. Cade remained standing exactly where he had knelt, staring after her, his hands curled into fists at his sides, as though he were holding himself together through sheer force of will. The whispers of the court rose around him like a tide, questions no one dared ask aloud, but Ilara could feel them pressing against the air regardless. What is happening to our king? Why did he kneel? What is she to him? Ilara did not have answers to any of those questions. But walking through the long stone corridors of a castle she had entered as a prisoner and was somehow leaving as something else entirely, she knew one thing for certain. Nothing about her life would ever be simple again. Behind her, in the throne room, Cade finally allowed himself to breathe. His advisor, an older man named Edmund, who had served 3 generations of Ashgrove kings, approached cautiously, his face lined with worry. "My king," Edmund said carefully. "What was that?" Cade did not answer immediately. He stared at the empty space where Ilara had stood only moments before, his mind racing through possibilities he did not want to consider, memories of old stories his grandmother used to tell him as a child, stories he had dismissed as myth long ago. "Send for the oracle," he said finally. "Tonight, I do not care what hour it is." Edmund's eyebrows rose. The oracle had not been summoned to the castle in over a decade, not since Cade's father had ruled, and even then, only for matters of the gravest importance. "May I ask why?" Edmund said. Cade turned to face him, and for the first time since taking the throne, Edmund saw something in the young king's eyes that looked almost like fear. "Because I need to know," Cade said, "whether what just happened to me has a name, and whether it can be undone." But even as he said the words, some part of him, some quiet voice buried beneath years of built walls and hardened control, was not entirely certain he wanted it to be undone at all. Helen the Oracle arrived at Blackthorn Castle just after midnight, wrapped in a gray cloak that made her look like a shadow moving through the torchlit corridors. She was an old woman, her hair silver and her eyes clouded with age, but there was a sharpness in the way she studied Cade when she entered his private study that made him feel, for a brief moment, like a boy again rather than a king. "You summoned me," she said, lowering herself into a chair without waiting for permission. "This must be serious. You have not called for me since your father passed." Cade paced in front of the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. He had spent the last several hours trying to convince himself that what happened in the throne room was some kind of momentary weakness, a strange reaction to stress, anything other than what his instincts were telling him it truly was. But he could not shake the memory of his own body moving without his permission, his knees bending before he had decided to bend them, some force older and stronger than his own, will pulling him down in front of a woman he had never met before that day. "Something happened today," he said. "Something I cannot explain." He told her everything. The girl brought in for theft, the insult she spoke without fear, the moment his body betrayed him and lowered him to his knees in front of his entire court. Helen listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, though her eyes narrowed slightly when he described the strange warmth that had spread through his chest, the moment their eyes first met. When he finished, Helen was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as though searching for something within the flames. "Describe her to me," she said finally. "Not her appearance, something else. What did you feel when you first saw her?" Cade frowned, trying to put words to something that defied easy explanation. "Recognition," he said slowly, "as though I had known her for years, though I have never seen her before in my life. And underneath that, something else. A pull. Like my body wanted to move toward her, even while my mind was telling me to stay still." Helen closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there was something heavy in her expression, the weight of knowledge she clearly did not want to share. "There is an old bond," she said, "spoken of in the earliest histories of our people, long before your family took the throne, long before Blackthorn even had a name. It is called the true bond, and it does not appear often. Some rulers go their entire lives without ever encountering it. Your own father never did, nor did his father before him." "What does it mean?" Cade asked, though some part of him already suspected the answer and dreaded hearing it confirmed aloud. "It means the woman you brought into your court today is your fated mate," Helen said simply. "Bound to you not by choice or by chance, but by something written into your blood long before either of you were born." Cade stopped pacing. The word mate settled over him like a weight pressing down on his chest, and he found himself gripping the back of a nearby chair simply to steady himself. "That is not possible," he said. "I do not believe in old stories meant to frighten children." "Belief has nothing to do with it," Helen said, her voice sharpening slightly. "The bond does not ask for your permission any more than it asked for hers. It simply exists, and once it has been triggered, as it clearly has been today, it cannot be undone by wishing it away. You said the bond compels devotion, loyalty. That is common enough among mated pairs, is it not? I have heard of alphas who would die for their chosen mates." "This is different," Helen said. "The true bond does not simply bring devotion. In the rarest cases, cases so old they exist mostly as legend now, it reverses the natural order between an alpha and the one bound to him. It compels the alpha, no matter how powerful, no matter how feared, to submit before her, not out of weakness, out of the deepest recognition an alpha can experience, a recognition so absolute that his body responds before his mind has any say in the matter." Cade sank into the chair he had been gripping, his mind reeling. He thought of his father, a man who had ruled through fear and cruelty for 30 years, who had taught him from childhood that showing weakness of any kind was the fastest way to lose everything, including his life. He thought of every lesson drilled into him since he was old enough to understand words, lessons that had shaped him into the ruler he had become, feared by his enemies and obeyed without question by his own people. And now, in front of that same court, in front of nobles who had spent years fearing him, he had knelt before a common woman accused of stealing bread. "This cannot become known," he said finally. "If word spreads that the crown itself submits before some unknown woman, my enemies will see it as weakness. They will move against Blackthorn the moment they believe I can be controlled through her." "That is a real danger," Helen agreed. "But it is not the only one you should be concerned with." "What do you mean?" Helen leaned forward, her clouded eyes fixed on his. "The bond does not simply affect you, Cade. It affects her as well, whether she understands it yet or not. And if she is not protected, if she does not learn to understand what has awakened inside both of you, the consequences could be far worse than wounded pride among your nobles." Cade rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion settling into his bones in a way that battle had never managed to achieve. "What would you have me do?" "Keep her close," Helen said. "Not as a prisoner, not as a servant, but as someone under your protection, while she learns to understand what has happened to her. The bond will not simply disappear because you wish it to. It will grow stronger the longer you resist it, and the consequences of resisting a true bond are rarely gentle." "And if I choose to fight it regardless? If I refuse to let some old legend dictate the terms of my own crown?" Helen studied him for a long moment before answering. "Then you will likely destroy yourself trying," she said simply. "I have read of alphas who attempted exactly that. None of them ended their stories well." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and Cade stared into it, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, anger, and something else he refused to name, something that felt dangerously close to hope, though he could not begin to explain why hope would find its way into a heart he had spent years hardening against exactly that kind of feeling. Meanwhile, in the east wing of the castle, Ilara sat by the window of the room she had been given, unable to sleep despite the soft bed and warm blankets that felt strange after years of thin, patched quilts at home. Grace had brought her a simple meal earlier, along with fresh clothing, and had answered what few questions Alara dared to ask, with careful, guarded responses that told her almost nothing useful. "Is he always like that?" Alara had asked. "Cruel one moment, then suddenly not?" Grace had hesitated before answering. "I have served in this castle for 3 years," she said quietly. "I have never seen the king do what he did today, not once." That answer had unsettled Alara more than any explanation could have. She stared out the window now at the dark courtyard below, thinking of her siblings, Daniel and his stubborn refusal to admit when he was hungry, and little Grace, no older than 8, who still believed their parents might somehow return one day, despite everything that had happened. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it cautiously to find not Grace, but Cade himself, standing in the corridor, looking as though he had not slept at all. "May I speak with you?" he asked. His voice carried none of the cold authority from the throne room. He sounded, strangely, almost uncertain. Alara crossed her arms. "I suppose I do not have much choice, considering I am currently living in your castle against my will." "You have a choice," Cade said. "You could refuse. I would not force the conversation." Something in his tone made her step aside and allow him in. He entered slowly, glancing around the modest but comfortable room, as though seeing it for the first time, though she assumed he had likely never set foot in this part of the castle before tonight. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "though I am not entirely certain I understand it myself." "You could start," Alara said, "by telling me why you knelt. Everyone in that hall looked like they had seen the sky fall." Cade was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "There is an old bond among our people," he said finally, "one that connects certain pairs together in ways neither can control. I did not choose to kneel before you today. My body simply obeyed something older and stronger than my own will." Alara studied his face, searching for the deception she was certain must be hiding somewhere in his words, the same way she had searched for it in the throne room. But there was none, only confusion, and beneath that, something that looked almost like fear, an emotion she had never imagined associating with the most feared man in the kingdom. "That sounds like a very convenient excuse for a king who does not wish to admit he made a mistake," she said, though her voice lacked its earlier sharpness. "I understand why you would think that," Cade said. "I would think the same, if our positions were reversed. But I am telling you the truth, whether you choose to believe it or not." "And what exactly does this bond mean? For me?" Cade hesitated, and in that hesitation, Alara saw something that told her the answer was larger and more complicated than he was prepared to explain in a single conversation. "It means," he said finally, "that our lives are now connected in ways neither of us asked for and neither of us can easily undo. I do not expect you to understand that tonight, or even to accept it, but I am asking you to stay here, under my protection, while we both learn what it truly means." Alara turned back toward the window, watching the moon hang low over the dark courtyard, thinking of everything her life had been only yesterday, simple and hard and entirely her own to manage. Now, somehow, it had become tangled with the fate of a king she had insulted in front of his entire court. A man who claimed some invisible force had forced him to kneel before her. "I do not trust you," she said quietly. "I want to be clear about that." "I would not expect you to," Cade said. "Trust is not something I am asking for tonight. Only patience, while we both figure out what comes next." Alara did not answer immediately. But when she finally turned back to face him, something had shifted slightly in her expression. Not trust exactly, but perhaps the smallest opening toward the possibility of it. A crack in the wall she had built around herself the moment she was dragged into his throne room in chains. "Fine," she said, "but if I learn you are lying to me, king or not, you will regret it." For the first time since she had met him, Cade's mouth curved into something that was almost, though not quite, a smile. "I do not doubt that for a moment," he said. Word of the strange event in the throne room spread through Blackthorn Castle, faster than any royal decree ever could. By the second morning, servants whispered about it in the kitchens, guards muttered about it during shift changes, and nobles exchanged nervous glances whenever the topic arose in conversation, careful never to speak of it too loudly in case the king himself might overhear. Lara noticed the way people looked at her as she walked the castle corridors under Grace's careful guidance. Some stared with open curiosity, others with something closer to suspicion, as though she had cast some kind of spell over their ruler rather than simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. A few, mostly younger servants, looked at her with an emotion she found harder to place, something almost like hope, as though her presence might somehow soften a king they had all learned to fear. "They think I bewitched him," Ilara said to Grace as they walked through the castle gardens on the third day, the autumn air crisp against her skin. "As if I asked for any of this." "They do not know what to think," Grace admitted. "None of us do. The king has never behaved this way before, not once, in all my years serving here." "What was he like before?" Ilara asked. "Before all of this." Grace considered the question carefully, glancing around to make sure no one else was close enough to overhear. "Harsh," she said finally. "Distant. He rarely spoke to anyone outside his closest advisors, and even then, only when necessary. Some said he had not laughed since his father died, though I could not say if that is true or simply castle gossip." "How did his father die?" "An illness, they say, though there are always other stories whispered in the shadows. His father was not a kind man, from what I have heard the older servants say. Cruel, even to his own family. The old king ruled through fear and taught his son to do the same." Ilara thought of the moment Cade had knelt before her, the confusion and something that looked almost like desperation in his eyes, so different from the cold authority he had displayed only seconds before. She thought of how carefully he had spoken to her the night before, choosing his words with something that resembled genuine effort rather than the practiced diplomacy of a ruler accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. Perhaps, she thought, there was more to this man than the reputation that preceded him. That afternoon, she found herself in the castle library, a room larger than her entire childhood home, filled with more books than she had ever seen gathered in one place. She had come searching for anything that might explain the strange bond Cade had described, some old text that might help her understand what exactly had happened to change the course of her life so suddenly and so completely. She did not expect to find Cade there as well, seated at a table near the far window, a stack of old books open before him, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "I did not expect to find you here," he said finally. "I could say the same," Ilara replied, glancing at the books spread across his table. "Researching your own predicament?" "Something like that." He gestured to the chair across from him. "You are welcome to join if you wish." "I imagine you have questions I have not yet answered." Ilara hesitated, then sat, curiosity winning out over her lingering caution. Up close, she could see the exhaustion etched into his face, the shadows beneath his eyes, suggesting he had not slept properly since the day she arrived. "You look tired," she said, before she could stop herself. "I have not slept well," Cade admitted. "There is a great deal to consider. My advisors are concerned about how this will appear to our neighboring territories, should word spread beyond these walls. Kingdoms that fear Blackthorn's strength may see this as an opportunity, if they believe the crown has developed a weakness they can exploit. Is that truly what worries you most? How this appears to others?" Cade was quiet for a moment, turning a page in the book before him without truly reading it. "No," he admitted finally. "What worries me most is that I do not know how to be the kind of man this bond seems to demand of me. I have spent my entire life learning to rule through strength, through control. My father taught me that showing anything else invites disaster. And now I am told that some part of me is fated to kneel before someone else entirely, and I do not know how to reconcile that with everything I have built myself to be." Ilara studied him carefully, surprised by the honesty in his admission. This was not the ruthless king from the stories, the man who executed traitors without hesitation. This was someone far more uncertain, wrestling with something he clearly had not chosen and did not fully understand. My mother used to say, Elara said slowly, that true strength was not about controlling everyone around you. It was about having the courage to be honest, even when honesty was harder than pretending. Your mother sounds wise. She was. Elara's voice softened, a flicker of grief passing across her face before she pushed it away. She died 3 years ago, my father not long after. It has been just my siblings and myself since then. Cade set down the book he had been holding, giving her his full attention. I am sorry for your loss, he said, and something in his voice told her the sentiment was genuine, rather than the practiced condolence of someone accustomed to offering empty words. It happened during a border conflict, Elara continued, though she was not entirely sure why she was sharing this with him, only that something about the quiet library and his undivided attention made the words easier to speak than they usually were. Raiders attacked our village. My parents did not survive. Something shifted in Cade's expression, a flicker of unease that Elara noticed, but could not immediately interpret. He opened his mouth as though to say something, then seemed to reconsider, closing it again. What is it? She asked. Nothing, he said, though his voice had grown quieter. I am simply sorry that happened to your family. No one should have to endure that kind of loss. Elara studied him for a moment longer, sensing there was something more beneath his careful words, something he was choosing not to say. But she did not press further, not yet, not when the conversation between them had finally begun to feel less like a battle and more like something approaching understanding. Tell me about your father, she said instead, changing the subject. Grace mentioned he was not a kind man. Cade's jaw tightened slightly. He believed cruelty was the only language that commanded true respect. He taught me to rule the same way, from the time I was old enough to understand what ruling meant. I watched him execute men for minor offenses, watched him tear families apart over debts that could have been forgiven with a single word. And I told myself, for years, that this was simply what strength looked like. And now? Now I am no longer certain that was strength at all, he admitted. Perhaps it was simply fear, dressed up in a crown. The admission hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them had expected. Elara found herself studying this man with new eyes, seeing past the reputation that had followed him into that throne room, seeing instead someone who had been shaped by cruelty and was only now beginning to question whether that shaping had been right at all. Why are you telling me this? She asked. You barely know me. I am not entirely certain, Cade admitted. Perhaps it is the bond. Perhaps it is simply that you are the first person in a very long time who has spoken to me without fear coloring every word. Elara considered this, thinking of the moment in the throne room when she had spoken her mind without hesitation, not because she was brave exactly, but because she had reached a point where fear no longer mattered as much as the truth did. I am still angry about the state of this kingdom, she said. About the taxes that starve families like mine while nobles feast. That has not changed simply because you knelt before me, or because some old bond apparently connects us now. I do not expect it to change, Cade said, and you are right to be angry. I have not been the ruler my people deserve. Perhaps it is time that changed as well. Elara studied him carefully, searching for the sincerity behind his words, and found, to her genuine surprise, that she believed him. Not entirely, not yet, not enough to trust him completely, but enough to consider that perhaps the man before her was not entirely the monster his reputation suggested. Over the following days, their conversations continued, sometimes in the library, sometimes during walks through the gardens where Cade would ask about her siblings, about her childhood, about the small details of a life so different from his own that he seemed genuinely fascinated by all of it. In turn, Elara learned more about the burdens he carried, the weight of a crown he had inherited before he was truly ready, the constant pressure of neighboring territories watching for any sign of weakness they might exploit. Slowly, carefully, something began to shift between them. A fragile understanding built not on the strange bond neither of them had chosen, but on conversations that felt, increasingly, like genuine connection. But even as that understanding grew, a truth remained buried beneath the surface, one that Cade had not yet found the courage to share, one that Alara had not yet discovered on her own. The border conflict that had taken her parents had not been a random raid at all. It had been a delayed response, forces sent too late by a young king still learning the weight of his new crown, forces that arrived only after the damage had already been done. And when that truth finally surfaced, as truths always eventually do, it threatened to destroy everything they had carefully begun to build between them. 2 weeks passed, and Alara found herself settling into a rhythm inside Blackthorn Castle that she never expected to feel comfortable with, yet somehow did. Grace had become something close to a friend, sharing small pieces of gossip and laughter during the quiet hours of the afternoon. The kitchen staff had grown used to her presence, no longer whispering when she passed. Even some of the guards, once stiff and suspicious around her, had begun offering small nods of greeting. Her siblings, she had learned through carefully delivered letters, were doing well. Daniel had written to her twice, his handwriting messy but full of excitement about the food that arrived regularly at their door, more food than their family had seen in months. Grace, the younger one, had drawn a small picture of a castle at the bottom of one letter, insisting she wanted to visit someday. Alara kept both letters tucked beneath her pillow, reading them each night before sleep, a reminder of exactly why she had agreed to stay in the first place. But it was not only her siblings' well-being that kept her within Blackthorn's walls now. It was Cade himself, though she was not yet ready to admit that fully, even to herself. Their conversations had grown longer, more comfortable, stretching late into the evenings when neither of them seemed willing to be the first to leave the library or the quiet corner of the garden where they often found themselves. She had learned about his childhood, about a mother who had died when he was young, leaving him alone with a father who ruled through fear rather than love. She had learned about the weight he carried every single day, trying to hold together a kingdom that seemed constantly on the edge of conflict with its neighbors, trying to be strong enough that no one would ever see him as vulnerable, the way his father had taught him vulnerability could get a man killed. In turn, she had shared pieces of herself she rarely shared with anyone. The exhaustion of raising 2 younger siblings alone, the fear that kept her awake some nights, wondering if she was doing right by them, the anger that still burned quietly beneath her calm exterior, anger at a world that had taken her parents and left her with burdens far too heavy for someone her age to carry alone. It was during one of these late evening conversations, seated together near the fireplace in a quiet sitting room while rain fell steadily outside the windows, that the truth finally found its way into the open. "I want to ask you something," Alara said, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "About the raid that took my parents." Cade went very still beside her. "What would you like to know?" "The soldiers who were supposed to defend the border villages. Why were they so delayed? My father always said help should have arrived hours before it did. If it had come sooner, perhaps." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought, the old grief rising unexpectedly sharp in her chest. Cade was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Alara felt something cold settle over her, an instinct warning her that his silence meant something significant. "What is it?" she asked. "You know something about this." Cade set down the cup he had been holding, his hands not quite steady. "I was young when that raid occurred," he said slowly. "Barely on the throne. My father had died only months before, and I was still learning how to command, still learning who among my advisors could be trusted and who could not. What does that have to do with the delay?" "There was a miscommunication," Cade continued, his voice careful, measured, as though each word cost him something significant to speak. A message that should have reached the border garrison immediately was instead delayed by hours, caught in a chain of command that had not yet adjusted to my leadership. By the time reinforcements arrived, the raid had already ended. Alara felt her chest tighten. Are you telling me the delay that led to my parents' deaths happened because of decisions made under your rule? Yes, Cade said quietly, meeting her eyes despite how difficult it clearly was for him to do so. I did not learn the full details until much later, long after the damage had already been done. But the responsibility for that failure ultimately rests with me, as the ruler who was supposed to ensure such failures did not happen. Ilara stood abruptly, putting distance between them, her mind racing through years of grief now colored by a truth she had never expected to uncover, especially not from the man who had somehow become someone she trusted. You knew this, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. This entire time, you knew, and you said nothing. I did not know how to tell you, Cade admitted, rising as well but keeping his distance, sensing she needed space. I did not want you to see me as the reason for your family's greatest tragedy, not after everything we have begun to build between us. That was not your choice to make, Ilara said sharply. You do not get to decide what truths I deserve to know. You are right, Cade said. I should have told you sooner. I was afraid of exactly this reaction, and I let that fear guide my silence instead of doing what was right. Ilara paced the length of the room, her thoughts a tangled storm of grief and betrayal. Every conversation they had shared over the past 2 weeks now felt tainted by this hidden truth. Every moment of growing trust suddenly cast in a different, more painful light. I need time, she said finally, her voice quieter now, though no less firm. I cannot simply continue as though nothing has changed. I understand, Cade said, though the pain in his voice was evident. Take whatever time you need. Ilara left the room without another word, retreating to her chambers where she sat by the window long into the night, staring out at the rain-soaked courtyard below, her mind replaying every conversation, every small kindness Cade had shown her over the past 2 weeks, now uncertain how to feel about any of it. Part of her understood, in some distant, reasonable corner of her mind, that Cade had been young and inexperienced when the failure occurred, that a chain of command breaking down was not the same as deliberate cruelty. But the larger part of her, the part still raw with grief over parents she had lost far too young, could not easily separate the man she had begun to care for from the failure that had shaped the darkest tragedy of her life. Days passed with minimal contact between them. Ilara kept mostly to her chambers, or spent time with Grace in the kitchens, avoiding the library and the garden paths where she and Cade had once talked so freely. Cade, for his part, did not push her, though she noticed the toll her absence took on him. He looked more tired each day, more withdrawn during court proceedings, his advisors exchanging worried glances that Ilara pretended not to notice. It was Grace who finally broke through her careful avoidance, cornering her in the kitchen one afternoon while preparing tea. You cannot avoid him forever, Grace said gently. Whatever happened between you, I have never seen the king care about anything the way he seems to care about your well-being. He kept something important from me, Ilara said, something that mattered deeply. People make mistakes, Grace said, especially when they are afraid of losing something they have only just begun to value. That does not excuse the mistake, but perhaps it explains it. Ilara considered this, stirring her tea absently as she thought of everything Cade had shared with her over the past weeks, the vulnerability he had shown her that she suspected he rarely, if ever, showed anyone else. That evening, unable to settle her restless thoughts, Ilara made her way to the garden, drawn by memories of easier conversations shared beneath the stars. She found Cade there already, seated alone on a stone bench, staring up at the night sky with an expression of quiet exhaustion. He looked up when he heard her approach, surprise flickering across his face before he carefully schooled his expression into something more neutral. I did not expect to see you here, he said. I did not expect to come, Ilara admitted, sitting on the opposite end of the bench, keeping a careful distance between them. But I have been thinking about everything you told me. And I am still angry, she said honestly. I do not think that anger will disappear quickly. if it ever fully disappears at all. But I also understand that you were young, inexperienced, and that a failure in your chain of command is not the same as deliberately choosing to let my family suffer. Cade turned to face her fully. I have thought of little else since that night, he said. I have gone over every decision I made during those first months on the throne, wondering how many other failures occurred that I never learned about, how many other families suffered because I was not yet ready for the weight of the crown I inherited. That kind of thinking will destroy you if you let it, Ilara said. Trust me, I know what it is to carry guilt that serves no purpose, except to weigh you down further. What would you have me do instead? Ilara considered the question carefully. Learn from it, she said finally. Use it to become the kind of ruler who does not let such failures happen again. That will not undo what happened to my parents. Nothing will. But perhaps it can mean something, if it prevents similar tragedies for other families in the future. Cade studied her for a long moment, something like gratitude and relief mixing together in his expression. I would like that, he said quietly. I would like to become that kind of ruler, with your help, if you are willing to offer it. Ilara did not answer immediately, but she did not move away either, and slowly, carefully, she closed some of the distance between them on the bench, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. I am not offering forgiveness yet, she said. Not completely, but I am willing to keep talking, to keep trying to understand, if you are willing to keep being honest with me, even when honesty is difficult. I promise you that, Cade said, and this time, when their eyes met beneath the scattered stars overhead, something passed between them that neither the strange bond nor the painful truths of the past few days could fully diminish, a fragile but genuine understanding that perhaps, despite everything, they might still find their way toward something real. Neither of them yet knew that a far greater danger was already gathering beyond Blackthorn's borders, one that would soon test everything they had begun to build between them. In the weeks that followed, something quietly shifted inside Blackthorn Castle, so gradually that most of the staff barely noticed the change until it had already taken firm root. King Cade Ashgrove, long known for his harsh rulings and cold demeanor, began holding court differently. He listened more than he spoke during petitions from villagers seeking aid. He reduced the grain tax that had crushed families like Ilara's for years. He personally reviewed reports from border garrisons, determined never again to let a critical message become lost in a broken chain of command. Edmund, his oldest advisor, watched these changes with a mixture of confusion and cautious approval. The council has noticed the difference in you, Edmund said one afternoon, as they walked together through the castle's outer courtyard. Some believe it is a weakness, brought on by whatever bond has taken hold of you. Others believe it may be exactly what this kingdom has needed for years. And what do you believe? Cade asked. Edmund considered the question carefully before answering. I believe your father ruled through fear because he did not know another way to hold power. I believe you are discovering there might be a better way, and I believe that terrifies some of the older nobles more than any war ever could. Cade thought of Ilara, of the quiet strength in the way she spoke about fairness and justice, ideas that had once seemed impractical to him, luxuries a ruler focused on survival could not afford. Yet the more time he spent with her, the more he began to understand that perhaps fairness and strength were not opposites at all, but two halves of the same whole. Their relationship, fragile after the painful truth about her parents had come to light, slowly began to heal. Ilara still carried grief, still occasionally grew quiet when memories of her parents surfaced unexpectedly, but she no longer avoided Cade's company. Their conversations resumed, deeper now, built on the honesty that had nearly broken them apart, but had ultimately strengthened the foundation between them instead. One afternoon, walking together through the castle's training grounds, Ilara watched as young soldiers practiced hand-to-hand combat under Cade's instruction, his voice patient in a way that surprised her given the reputation that had once preceded him. You are good with them, she observed, as a young recruit successfully executed a difficult maneuver and beamed with pride at Cade's approving nod. They remind me of myself at that age, Cade admitted. Eager to prove themselves, uncertain of their place in the world. I try to be the kind of teacher my father never was for me. Your father sounds like he caused you more harm than you often admit, Ilara said gently. Cade was quiet for a moment, watching the recruits continue their drills. He believed love was a weakness that would get me killed on the battlefield, he said finally. He rarely showed affection, even to my mother, before she died. I grew up believing that ruling meant being feared rather than loved, that softness of any kind invited disaster. And now? Now I am beginning to wonder if he was simply wrong, Cade said, turning to look at her directly. About a great many things. Ilara felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, though she tried to keep her expression carefully neutral, unwilling to fully surrender to the feelings that had been steadily growing despite her initial determination to resist them. Their bond, meanwhile, continued to deepen in ways neither of them fully understood. Cade found himself instinctively attuned to Ilara's moods, sensing when something troubled her even before she spoke of it. Ilara, in turn, discovered she could sense the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him during difficult council meetings, an awareness that went beyond simple observation into something that felt deeply intuitive. Helen, the oracle, visited the castle again during this period, observing the two of them together with careful, studying eyes. The bond grows stronger, she told Cade privately, after watching him and Ilara share a quiet meal together in the garden. This is a good sign, though it also means the danger grows alongside it. What danger? Cade asked. A bond this rare does not go unnoticed forever, Helen said. Word has already begun to spread beyond these walls, carried by traveling merchants and diplomats who witnessed the events in your throne room. Kingdoms that have long resented Blackthorn's strength may see an opportunity in what they perceive as a new vulnerability. Cade's expression hardened. Let them try. Blackthorn's strength has not diminished. Perhaps not, Helen said carefully. But your enemies may not see it that way. A king who submits before another, even in matters of the heart, may appear weak to those seeking any excuse to challenge your rule. I would advise increased caution, particularly regarding Ilara's safety. If your enemies believe controlling her means controlling you, they will not hesitate to act on that belief. Cade absorbed this warning with growing concern, though he said nothing of it to Ilara at first, unwilling to burden her with fears that might not yet be fully realized. He did, however, quietly increase security around the castle, adding additional guards to patrol the grounds and instructing his most trusted soldiers to keep careful watch over Ilara whenever she left the safety of the castle walls. Ilara noticed the increased presence of guards, but assumed it was simply standard precaution, unaware of the specific concerns driving Cade's decision. She continued her days much as before, spending time with Grace in the kitchens, walking the garden paths, and increasingly, spending quiet evenings with Cade, discussing everything from castle politics to childhood memories, their conversations flowing more easily now than they had even before the painful revelation about her parents. One evening, as autumn began to give way to the first cold breath of winter, Cade found Ilara in the library, curled in a chair near the fireplace with a book open in her lap, though her attention seemed to have drifted elsewhere. You look troubled, he observed, settling into the chair across from her. I received a letter from Daniel today, she said. He mentioned some men asking questions in the village, asking about our family, about my connection to the castle. It unsettled him. Cade's jaw tightened, Helen's warning echoing in his thoughts. What kind of questions? He was not entirely certain, just that the men seemed overly curious about details that should not matter to strangers. It is probably nothing, Ilara said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested she did not fully believe her own reassurance. I will send additional guards to watch over your siblings, Cade said immediately, just as a precaution. Ilara studied him carefully, noticing the tension in his shoulders that had not been there moments before. You know something, she said. Something you are not telling me. Cade hesitated, then decided that after everything they had already weathered together, Honesty remained the only path forward that made sense. Helen believes our bond may have drawn unwanted attention from kingdoms that see Blackthorn's current situation as an opportunity to exploit, he admitted. I did not want to alarm you unnecessarily, but perhaps I should have told you sooner. Ilara absorbed this information, old instincts of caution rising within her, tempered now by a growing trust in the man before her. Thank you for telling me, she said, even if it is frightening. I will not let anything happen to you, Cade said, his voice carrying a fierce certainty that left no room for doubt. Or to your siblings. I promise you that. Ilara believed him, more completely than she had believed anything in a very long time, though a quiet unease still lingered in the back of her mind, a sense that whatever danger Helen had warned of was not simply a distant possibility, but something already beginning to move closer, gathering strength in shadows neither of them could yet fully see. That night, in a fortress far beyond Blackthorn's borders, a rival alpha named Victor Ashcombe listened carefully as his spies delivered their report, a calculating smile spreading slowly across his face as he absorbed every detail about the strange bond that had settled over his greatest rival. The ruthless king of Blackthorn, brought low by some common girl, Victor said, turning a goblet of wine slowly in his hand as he considered the possibilities now open before him. This is an opportunity I do not intend to waste. His advisors exchanged uncertain glances as he began outlining a plan that would soon shatter the fragile peace Cade and Ilara had only just begun to build, a plan that would test not only the strength of their unlikely bond, but the very survival of everything they had come to care about. Victor Ashcombe had ruled the northern territory of Greyfen for nearly a decade, building his power through careful alliances and quiet manipulation rather than open warfare, a strategy that had allowed him to expand his influence without ever drawing the full attention of stronger kingdoms like Blackthorn. But Cade Ashgrove's unexpected vulnerability had presented an opportunity too tempting to ignore. Tell me again what your spies witnessed, Victor said, seated at the head of a long table in his war room, surrounded by advisors who had learned long ago never to question his ambitions too openly. His spy master, a sharp-eyed woman named Clara, stepped forward with a detailed account. The king of Blackthorn knelt before a common woman in front of his entire court, she said. Witnesses confirm it was no performance. The oracle Helen was summoned that same night, suggesting the king himself sought answers to explain his own behavior. A true bond, Victor mused, tapping his fingers thoughtfully against the table. I had believed such things were nothing more than old legends told to frighten young pups into believing fate controlled more than it truly did. Whether legend or truth, Clara said, the effect on Blackthorn's king appears genuine. Sources within the castle report increased security, particularly around the woman in question. It seems the king fears exactly what we might attempt. Victor's smile widened. Then he is not entirely foolish, despite his sentiment. If this woman holds such power over Blackthorn's ruler, controlling her would mean controlling him. Imagine Clara, an alpha king forced to kneel not only before his fated mate, but before whoever holds her captive. A dangerous strategy, one of the older advisors cautioned. Blackthorn's forces remain formidable, bond or no bond. If we act against them and fail, the consequences could be severe. We will not fail, Victor said, his voice carrying the absolute confidence of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted through patience and careful planning. We simply need to be precise. Clara, learn everything you can about the woman's movements, her routines, anywhere she travels beyond the castle's protection. Every fortress has gaps in its defenses, no matter how carefully guarded. We simply need to find Blackthorns. Over the following weeks, Clara's network of spies embedded themselves carefully throughout the region surrounding Blackthorn, gathering information with patient precision. They learned of Ilara's occasional visits to her siblings in the city, always accompanied by guards but not always through the same route or at the same time. They learned of a market day each week, when security, though present, grew slightly less rigid amid the crowds and chaos of merchants and townspeople going about their business. Back in Blackthorn, unaware of the careful calculations being made against her, Ilara continued adjusting to her new life within the castle walls, her bond with Cade deepening with each passing day. Winter had settled fully over the kingdom now, blanketing the courtyards in fresh snow, and the castle had taken on a quieter, more intimate atmosphere as the harsher weather kept most outdoor activities limited. "I want to visit my siblings," Ilara told Cade one morning, as frost patterns decorated the windows of the room where they shared breakfast together, a routine that had become comfortably familiar over the past month. "It has been too long since I last saw them in person." Letters are not the same. Cade's brow furrowed with immediate concern, Helen's warnings and the recent unsettling reports from Daniel still fresh in his mind. "I would prefer additional guards accompany you," he said, "more than usual, given recent circumstances." "I understand your caution," Ilara said, though a note of frustration colored her voice. "But I cannot live the rest of my life confined behind these walls out of fear of a danger that may never materialize. My siblings need to see me. I need to see them." Cade considered her words carefully, torn between his instinct to protect her completely and his understanding that Ilara was not someone who would accept being treated as fragile or helpless. She had survived on her own for years, raising two younger siblings through hardship that would have broken many people. Confining her against her will, however well-intentioned, would only strain the fragile trust they had worked so carefully to rebuild. "Very well," he said finally, "but I insist on accompanying you myself this time, along with a full guard escort. I will not compromise on your safety, even if I am willing to compromise on how that safety is achieved." Ilara considered this offer and found she did not mind the idea of Cade joining her, a realization that surprised her slightly, given how far their relationship had traveled from the tension of their first encounter in the throne room. "I would like that," she admitted. The journey to the city proceeded without incident, the winter air crisp and cold as their small procession made its way through streets dusted with fresh snow. Ilara's reunion with Daniel and young Grace was joyful, filled with laughter and questions about castle life that Ilara answered with patient amusement, watching as Cade, initially awkward and uncertain around the children, gradually warmed to their curious questions about his role as king. "Is it true you have 100 guards just for yourself?" Daniel asked, eyes wide with the kind of exaggerated curiosity only a young boy could manage. Cade's mouth quirked slightly. "Not quite 100, he said, "though it sometimes feels that way." Young Grace, meanwhile, had taken an immediate liking to him, insisting he examine her latest drawing of the castle with the seriousness the moment demanded. Watching Cade crouch down to study the child's artwork with genuine attention, offering thoughtful praise for details she had included, Ilara felt something warm settle deep in her chest, a feeling she was no longer trying quite so hard to deny. They stayed longer than originally planned, the visit stretching into the afternoon as the siblings reluctantly said their goodbyes, promising to write again soon. As their procession began the journey back toward the castle, the winter sun already beginning its early descent toward the horizon, Ilara felt more at peace than she had in weeks, the earlier tension about potential danger fading into the comfortable warmth of a good day spent with people she loved. She did not notice the figures watching carefully from a distance, tucked among the shadows of narrow alleyways, tracking their movements with careful, patient attention. That evening, back within the safety of Blackthorn Castle, Cade received an urgent report from one of his own scouts, information that immediately reignited the concerns he had allowed himself to briefly set aside during the peaceful visit with Ilara's siblings. "Increased activity along the northern border," the scout reported. "Grayfen forces have been observed moving in numbers larger than typical patrol formations would require. Our informants suggest Victor Ashcombe may be planning something, though the exact nature of his intentions remains unclear." Cade's expression darkened considerably. Victor had long been a source of quiet tension between their territories, though outright conflict had been avoided through careful diplomacy for years. This sudden shift in behavior, occurring so soon after word of his bond with Elara had likely spread beyond Blackthorn's borders, felt far too coincidental to ignore. He immediately summoned Edmund and his military commanders, spending the remainder of the evening in careful strategic discussion, weighing the possibility of Victor's involvement against the need to avoid provoking unnecessary conflict based on incomplete information. "Should we warn Elara?" Edmund asked, as the meeting finally began winding down late into the night. Cade considered the question carefully. Part of him wanted to shield her entirely from these growing concerns, to protect the fragile peace they had built together from the shadow of external threats. But another part of him, the part that had grown to genuinely respect her strength and resilience, understood that keeping her uninformed would only repeat the same mistake that had nearly destroyed their trust once already. "Yes," he said finally, "she deserves to know." The next morning, he found her in the garden despite the cold, wrapped warmly in a heavy cloak, watching frost patterns form delicate lace across the bare branches of winter trees. He explained everything Helen had warned him about, everything his scouts had recently reported regarding Victor Ashcomb's suspicious troop movements, watching her expression carefully as the information settled over her. "You believe he intends to use me against you," Elara said slowly, understanding dawning clearly in her eyes. "It is a strong possibility," Cade admitted. "I do not say this to frighten you, but because you deserve to understand the full picture, especially now that we know the danger is not simply hypothetical." Elara absorbed this information with a steadiness that Cade found himself deeply admiring, no hint of panic in her demeanor, only careful, focused consideration. "Then we prepare," she said simply. "I will not let fear keep me locked away, but I also will not be reckless given what you have told me. What do you need from me?" "Increased caution," Cade said. "No unnecessary trips beyond the castle walls until we better understand Victor's intentions." "I know that is not the answer you likely wanted to hear." "No," Elara agreed. "But I understand the necessity, given what is at stake. Not only for myself, but for my siblings as well, should Victor decide they represent a useful target." Cade's expression hardened at this thought, a fierce protectiveness rising within him that went beyond simple duty as a ruler and reached instead into something far more personal, far more deeply felt. "I will ensure your siblings' safety as well," he said firmly. "I will not allow Victor Ashcombe, or anyone else, to threaten the people you love." Elara studied him carefully, seeing in his eyes the same fierce determination that had once frightened her when she believed it belonged to a cruel and ruthless ruler, but now understood belonged instead to a man determined to protect what he had come to genuinely care about. "Thank you," she said softly, reaching out to take his hand, a small gesture that had become increasingly natural between them over the past weeks. "For being honest with me, even when honesty is difficult." "Always," Cade promised, squeezing her hand gently in return. But even as they stood together in the quiet winter garden, drawing strength and comfort from each other's presence, neither of them could have predicted just how soon Victor Ashcomb's careful planning would finally reach its breaking point, or how close they would soon come to losing everything they had worked so hard to build. Nearly 3 weeks passed without further incident, and the careful precautions Cade had put in place seemed, for a time, to hold Victor's ambitions at bay. Elara remained mostly within the castle grounds, occupying herself with lessons in reading and writing that Grace had offered to help with, along with growing responsibilities that Cade had begun entrusting to her. Small matters of court that allowed her voice and perspective to influence decisions affecting the common people of Blackthorn. She found she enjoyed this unexpected role more than she had anticipated, using her own experiences of hardship to advocate for policies that eased the burden on struggling families throughout the kingdom. Cade listened to her suggestions with genuine consideration, often implementing changes she proposed, a partnership forming between them that extended far beyond the strange bond that had first brought them together. But the quiet peace could not last forever. It happened on an afternoon that began like any other, unremarkable in every way until it suddenly was not. Ilara had traveled to the city with a modest guard escort to deliver supplies to a struggling orphanage she had taken a personal interest in supporting, a routine trip she had made several times over the past weeks without incident. The winter sun hung pale and distant overhead as their small group made their way through the familiar streets, snow crunching softly beneath their horses' hooves. The attack came without warning. Figures emerged suddenly from narrow side streets, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of careful planning rather than opportunistic chance. Ilara's guards fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered from the very first moment, the ambush executed with ruthless efficiency by soldiers clearly loyal to Victor Ashcombe, their unfamiliar insignia visible on cloaks as they moved to surround her. "Do not harm her," a commanding voice called out amid the chaos. "Lord Ashcombe wants her unharmed." Ilara fought against the hands that grabbed her, years of quiet strength and determination fueling a resistance fiercer than her captors had anticipated. But ultimately, she was overwhelmed, a cloth pressed against her face that carried a sharp, unfamiliar scent, and darkness closed in around her before she could call out one final time for help that would not arrive in time. Back at the castle, Cade felt the change the moment it happened, a sudden, violent wrongness settling into his chest that had nothing to do with any report reaching him yet. He had grown increasingly attuned to Ilara's presence through their bond, a subtle awareness of her well-being that had become as natural as breathing over the past weeks. But this feeling was different, sharp and alarming, like something essential had been suddenly and violently severed. He was already moving toward the courtyard, calling for his commanders, when a badly wounded guard stumbled through the castle gates, barely able to stand, blood soaking through a hastily applied bandage on his shoulder. "My king," the guard gasped. "She has been taken. Greyfen soldiers. They came from nowhere. We could not stop them." The rest of his report was lost to Cade as a wave of fury and terror, unlike anything he had ever experienced, crashed through him, so intense that for a moment he could barely draw breath. Every instinct screamed at him to move immediately, to tear through the city with his bare hands if necessary until he found her. But years of discipline forced him to push past the overwhelming panic long enough to think clearly. "Full mobilization," he ordered, his voice carrying a lethal calm that belied the storm raging within him. "Every available soldier, every tracker we have. I want Greyfen's movements traced within the hour." Edmund arrived moments later, his face pale as he absorbed the news. "My king, we must proceed carefully. If Victor believes he holds leverage over you, rash action could put her in greater danger." "I am aware of that," Cade said, his hands clenched into fists at his sides as he fought to maintain control over the fury threatening to consume him entirely. "But I will not simply wait while she remains in danger. We move immediately, but carefully. I want every path toward Greyfen territory watched. If they attempt to move her across the border, I want to know the moment it happens." Within hours, Blackthorn's forces had mobilized with an efficiency that spoke to years of careful military preparation, though every soldier could sense the barely contained rage simmering beneath their king's controlled exterior. Trackers fanned out from the site of the ambush, following faint trails through the snow that led steadily northward, toward the border of Greyfen territory. Cade rode at the head of the pursuing force himself, refusing every suggestion from his advisors that he remain safely behind while others handled the rescue. The bond that connected him to Ilara had become a physical ache in his chest, a constant reminder of her distant presence, faint but still detectable, which told him she remained alive, though the awareness offered little comfort given how thoroughly unknown her current condition remained. Meanwhile, Ilara slowly regained consciousness in an unfamiliar room, her head throbbing painfully from whatever substance had been used to subdue her. She found herself in a stone chamber, sparsely furnished but not entirely uncomfortable, a fact that struck her as strange given the violence of her abduction. A heavy door, clearly locked, stood between her and freedom, and a single narrow window revealed unfamiliar landscape beyond, confirming she had been moved a significant distance from Blackthorn. The door opened some time later, and a man she did not recognize entered, his bearing immediately suggesting someone accustomed to power and authority. "Lady Alara," he said, his voice smooth and calculating, "I apologize for the rough manner of your arrival. I am Victor Ashcombe, and I have been eager to make your acquaintance for quite some time now." Alara straightened, despite her lingering dizziness, refusing to show the fear that quietly coiled in her stomach. "You have made a grave mistake," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Cade will not simply allow this to stand." "I am counting on that," Victor said, a satisfied smile spreading across his features. "In fact, that is precisely the point. A king so bound to his fated mate that he loses all sense of caution, all strategic thinking, driven entirely by desperation to reclaim her. Such a man becomes remarkably easy to defeat." "You underestimate him," Alara said. "And you underestimate me as well, if you believe I will simply sit here and wait quietly for whatever plan you have devised." Victor's smile did not waver, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes, a hint of reluctant respect for her defiance, despite her precarious position. "We shall see, Lady Alara. In the meantime, please make yourself comfortable. You will be here for some time yet, while I finalize the details of my invitation to your king." He left without further explanation, the heavy door locking firmly behind him, leaving Alara alone once more, with her racing thoughts and the growing, aching awareness of Cade's presence through their bond. Distant, but unmistakably real, carrying with it a fierce determination that gave her the strength to refuse despair, no matter how uncertain her current circumstances truly were. She began examining every inch of her prison, searching for any weakness she might exploit, any possibility of escape or resistance that might improve her situation before Cade's forces, wherever they currently were, managed to locate her. The window was too narrow and too high to offer any realistic path to freedom, but she noted its position carefully regardless, filing away every detail that might prove useful later. As the hours passed and darkness fell outside, Alara sat quietly against the stone wall of her chamber, focusing on the bond that connected her to Cade, sending what she hoped was some measure of reassurance and strength through whatever mysterious connection linked them together, even as she could not know for certain whether such communication was truly possible. Far to the south, riding hard through the darkening winter landscape, Cade felt something shift subtly within the bond, a flicker of determination and resilience that reached him despite the distance separating them, and he found himself gripping his horse's reins with renewed purpose, pushing his pursuing force onward through the night with an intensity that left even his most hardened soldiers struggling to match his relentless pace. "We are close," his lead tracker reported, examining fresh signs along the trail by torchlight. "The trail leads directly toward Ashcombe's primary fortress. We should reach the border by dawn." "Then we ride through the night," Cade said, his voice carrying no hesitation despite the exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "I will not rest until she is safely returned to me." The pursuing force pressed onward through the darkness, driven by their king's unwavering determination, unaware of exactly what awaited them at Victor Ashcombe's fortress, but united in their absolute resolve to bring their queen home, whatever the cost required to achieve it. Dawn broke gray and cold over Victor Ashcombe's fortress, the first pale light revealing Cade's forces gathered at the edge of the surrounding forest, having covered the distance through the night with a speed that had surprised even his most seasoned commanders. The fortress itself rose stark against the winter sky, its walls thick and well defended, exactly the kind of stronghold Victor had spent years reinforcing against exactly this kind of confrontation. "He will have anticipated our arrival," Edmund said quietly, studying the fortress walls through the early morning mist. "Victor is not a man who leaves such matters to chance." "I am counting on that," Cade replied, his eyes fixed on the fortress with an intensity that had not wavered throughout the entire grueling journey. Through their bond, he could still sense Ilara's presence, steady and resolute despite the danger surrounding her, a small but constant reassurance that had kept him focused through the exhausting ride north. As if summoned by their arrival, the fortress gates opened, and Victor Ashcombe himself emerged, flanked by a modest guard, his expression carrying the confident calm of a man who believed he held every advantage in the confrontation about to unfold. "King Cade," Victor called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. "I had wondered how quickly you would arrive. Your dedication to your fated mate is truly remarkable." "Release her," Cade said, his voice carrying a lethal calm that masked the fury still burning beneath his controlled exterior. "This conflict need not escalate further than it already has." Victor's smile widened. "I am afraid it is not quite so simple. You see, I have given this considerable thought, and I believe there is a mutually beneficial arrangement we might reach, one that avoids unnecessary conflict between our territories." "I am listening," Cade said, though every instinct urged him toward immediate action rather than continued negotiation. "Recognition of Greyfen's independence from Blackthorn's influence," Victor said. "Favorable trade terms along our shared border. And a formal acknowledgement of my territory's equal standing among the kingdoms, rather than the subordinate position Blackthorn has long insisted upon. Agree to these terms, and your Lady Ilara will be returned to you unharmed." Cade's jaw tightened, weighing the demands against the desperate need to secure Ilara's safety. But something in Victor's confident posture, in the careful way he had structured his demands, told Cade this negotiation was not truly about the terms being offered at all. "And if I refuse?" Cade asked. Victor's expression darkened slightly. "Then I am afraid Lady Ilara's continued well-being becomes considerably less certain." Through their bond, Cade felt a sudden spike of fierce determination from Ilara, somewhere within the fortress walls, a feeling that told him she was not passively awaiting rescue, but actively searching for any opportunity to aid her own escape. That awareness, combined with growing certainty that Victor's confidence masked genuine uncertainty about how this confrontation would ultimately unfold, gave Cade the clarity he needed. "You have made a critical miscalculation," Cade said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "You believe this bond makes me weak, easily manipulated through threats against someone I care for, but you fail to understand what that bond truly represents. It has not weakened me, Victor. It has given me something worth protecting beyond mere territory and titles. And a man defending something he genuinely values fights with a strength that mere ambition can never match." As if in response to his words, a sudden commotion erupted from within the fortress walls, shouts and the clash of metal echoing out into the cold morning air. Victor's confident expression flickered with genuine surprise, his attention snapping toward the fortress behind him. Inside, Ilara had spent the night carefully working at the aging lock on her chamber door, with a hairpin she had concealed during her capture. Years of quiet resourcefulness from managing her family's survival now serving her in an entirely different kind of crisis. When the lock finally gave way just before dawn, she had slipped into the fortress corridors, moving carefully through shadows, searching for any path toward freedom while remaining alert to the sounds of Cade's forces she somehow sensed drawing steadily closer through their bond. She had encountered a guard near the fortress's eastern corridor, and rather than attempting to flee, had used the element of surprise and years of quiet physical training she had never expected to need to overwhelm him and secure his weapon, creating exactly the kind of internal chaos that now drew Victor's attention away from the standoff at his gates. Cade felt the shift in the bond immediately, a fierce satisfaction radiating from Ilara's presence that told him she had created an opening, and he moved without hesitation, signaling his forces forward as Victor turned back toward him, fury replacing his earlier confidence. "This changes nothing," Victor snarled, drawing his own weapon as Blackthorn's forces surged forward. But it changed everything. Cade moved through the resulting confrontation with a focus and determination that his soldiers would speak of for years afterward, cutting through Victor's forces with controlled, decisive efficiency, his every action driven by singular purpose rather than reckless fury. He found Ilara emerging from the fortress's eastern entrance just as he broke through the final line of resistance, her borrowed weapon still gripped firmly in her hand, a fierce light in her eyes, despite the exhaustion evident in her posture. "You came," she said, relief flooding through her voice as he closed the remaining distance between them. "I will always come for you," Cade said, reaching her side and pulling her into a fierce embrace, uncaring of the chaos still unfolding around them, needing only the confirmation that she was truly safe, truly whole, before he could allow himself to fully process the relief flooding through his chest. Victor's remaining forces, seeing their leader overwhelmed and their fortress breached, began laying down their weapons, recognizing the confrontation had turned decisively against them. Victor himself was subdued by Blackthorn's soldiers, his earlier confidence entirely replaced by the grim recognition that his careful plan had failed completely. "This is not over," Victor spat, as guards secured him for transport back to Blackthorn to face judgment for his actions. "For your sake," Cade said, still holding Ilara close against him, "I would strongly suggest that it is." As Blackthorn's forces began the process of securing the fortress and preparing for the journey home, Cade finally allowed himself a moment to simply hold Ilara, checking carefully for any injuries she might have sustained, his earlier controlled fury giving way to overwhelming relief now that she was safely back within his protection. "I am unharmed," she reassured him, noticing his careful, searching examination. "Frightened, certainly, but unharmed. Victor wanted me as leverage, not as a target for harm." "I felt something happen to our bond," Cade said, his voice still carrying traces of the fear that had driven him through the entire desperate night. "When you were first taken, I have never experienced anything so terrifying in my life." "I felt it too," Ilara admitted. "Your presence, growing steadily closer through the night. It gave me the strength to keep fighting, to believe you would truly come." "Always," Cade repeated, the promise carrying the full weight of everything he had come to understand about the bond that connected them. No longer something to fear or resist, but something he now recognized as the truest strength he had ever known. As they began the journey back toward Blackthorn, Ilara riding close beside him rather than in the protected carriage his commanders had initially suggested, insisting she was capable of managing the journey herself, Cade found himself reflecting on Victor's earlier accusation, the claim that their bond represented weakness rather than strength. He understood now, with a clarity that had eluded him even during their most vulnerable early conversations, that Victor could not have been more wrong. The bond had not weakened him. It had given him something genuine to fight for, beyond mere duty or obligation, a connection built on real understanding and growing love rather than the empty fear his father had once taught him was the only foundation worth building a reign upon. And as Blackthorn's fortress finally came into view on the horizon, its familiar walls a welcome sight after the exhausting ordeal they had both endured, Cade found himself already considering what came next, understanding that the events of the past days had crystallized something within him that he was no longer willing to keep uncertain or unspoken. The return to Blackthorn Castle was met with an outpouring of relief from every corner of the kingdom. News of Ilara's rescue had traveled ahead of their arrival, and crowds gathered along the roads leading into the city, watching as their king and the woman who had captured his heart rode through the gates together, both visibly exhausted, but unmistakably alive and safe. Grace and Daniel were waiting anxiously within the castle courtyard, having been brought to safety at Blackthorn the moment word of Ilara's abduction had reached the city, and their reunion was filled with tears and fierce embraces that left even the hardened castle guards blinking back unexpected emotion. "I was so frightened," young Grace admitted, clinging tightly to her older sister. "Daniel said you were strong enough to survive anything, but I was still so scared. I was scared too, Ilara admitted honestly, holding her siblings close. But I was never truly alone. Cade came for me, exactly as he promised he would. In the days that followed, life within Blackthorn Castle slowly returned to a more settled rhythm, though the events at Victor Ashcomb's fortress had left their mark on everyone involved. Victor himself remained in custody, his fate to be decided through careful negotiation between Blackthorn and the other kingdoms who had watched his failed gambit with considerable interest, wary now of testing Blackthorn's strength given how decisively Cade had responded to the threat against Ilara. Cade insisted Ilara rest fully before resuming any of her usual responsibilities, though she found herself growing restless within days, her natural resilience reasserting itself far more quickly than anyone, including herself, had anticipated. "You do not need to hover over me so carefully," she told him one afternoon, finding him once again checking on her well-being, despite her repeated reassurances that she had fully recovered from the ordeal. "I promise, I am not as fragile as you seem to believe." "I know you are not fragile," Cade said, settling beside her in the quiet sitting room where she had been reading. "I simply cannot easily forget how close I came to losing you entirely. That fear does not fade quickly, no matter how thoroughly you reassure me of your recovery." Ilara softened at the genuine vulnerability in his admission, reaching out to take his hand in the gesture that had become so naturally comfortable between them over recent months. "I understand," she said. "I felt the same fear, wondering if you would find me in time, wondering what might happen if you did not." "You never doubted I would come," Cade said, remembering her earlier words at the fortress. "Even during the worst of it." "I never doubted," Ilara confirmed. "Whatever fear I felt, I always believed you would find a way to reach me. Our bond made that certainty impossible to shake, even in the most frightening moments." Cade studied her carefully, something building within him that he had been considering seriously since their journey home from Victor's fortress, a decision that felt both natural and momentous in equal measure. "Ilara," he said, his voice carrying a seriousness that immediately drew her full attention. "These past months have changed me in ways I never expected when you were first brought before my throne. You have shown me a different way to rule, a different way to understand strength itself. I do not simply value our bond because it was fated to exist between us. I have come to genuinely love you, independent of anything the old legends might claim connects us together." Ilara's breath caught slightly at his words, though she had suspected, had perhaps even known, that her own feelings had grown to mirror his over recent months. Feelings she had been reluctant to fully name, even to herself given everything else occupying her thoughts and energy. "I love you as well," she said softly, the admission feeling both freeing and slightly overwhelming after everything they had weathered together. "Not because of any bond or fate, but because of who you have chosen to become, and who you continue choosing to become each day." Their relationship, already deepened considerably through the trials they had faced together, settled into something even more certain following this exchange, a foundation built not on the mysterious bond that had first drawn them together, but on genuine understanding, respect, and love that had grown steadily stronger through both hardship and quiet, ordinary moments shared between them. Word of Cade's transformation as a ruler continued spreading throughout the kingdom, as the changes he had implemented under Ilara's influence, reduced taxes, more equitable treatment of struggling villages, greater accountability within his chain of command, produced genuine improvements in the lives of Blackthorn's common people. Where fear had once been the primary tool of the crown's authority, something closer to genuine respect began taking root instead, a transformation that surprised even Cade's most skeptical advisors. Edmund, watching these developments with careful attention, found himself approaching Cade one evening with an observation he had been considering for some time. "Your father believed fear was the only foundation strong enough to hold a kingdom together," Edmund said. "But I have served this family for many years, through your father's reign and now through yours, and I believe I finally understand the flaw in that thinking." "What flaw is that?" Cade asked. Fear demands obedience, Edmund said, but it inspires no loyalty beyond self-preservation. The moment fear falters, so does the obedience built upon it. What you have built with Alara's guidance, genuine respect earned through fairness and accountability, that inspires something far more durable. Your people no longer simply fear crossing you. They genuinely believe in the kingdom you are building. Cade considered this observation carefully, recognizing the truth within it, a truth that would have seemed impossible to him only months earlier, before a woman dragged into his throne room in chains had somehow reshaped his entire understanding of what true strength required. As winter began giving way to the first signs of approaching spring, Blackthorn Castle prepared for a formal announcement that had been building steadily since Cade's private declaration to Alara weeks earlier. The Kingdom's Council, initially resistant to the unusual circumstances surrounding their king's fated bond, had gradually come to accept, and even celebrate, the positive changes Alara's presence had brought to Blackthorn's governance. The remaining question, one that Cade had been carefully considering how best to address, involved the formal recognition of their relationship before the entire kingdom, a public acknowledgement that would need to address both the unusual circumstances of their bond and the genuine partnership that had grown from it. The council believes a formal ceremony would help solidify public confidence, Edmund advised, as preparations began taking shape. Something that demonstrates both the strength of your bond and your continued commitment to the reforms you have implemented under Alara's influence. Cade agreed, understanding the political necessity while also recognizing something deeper, motivating his own eagerness for such a ceremony, a genuine desire to formally claim, before his entire kingdom, the woman who had transformed not only his understanding of leadership, but his entire understanding of himself. He found Alara in the garden one final time, before preparations for the ceremony would consume their remaining days. The first tentative signs of spring beginning to show among the previously frozen branches surrounding them. "I have something to ask you," he said, taking her hands in his as they stood together beneath the awakening trees. "Something I should have asked properly, rather than simply assuming our path forward, given everything the bond has already determined between us." Alara watched him carefully, sensing the significance of the moment building around them. "Alara Voss," Cade said, his voice carrying the same seriousness he brought to matters of state, though softened now with genuine emotion, he no longer felt any need to hide. "Will you stand beside me, not because fate demanded it, but because you choose it freely, as my equal partner in building the kind of kingdom we both believe Blackthorn can become?" Alara felt tears gathering in her eyes, though they were tears of genuine happiness, rather than any lingering sorrow from the difficult journey that had brought them to this moment. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion coloring it. "I choose this. I choose you, not because of any ancient bond, but because of everything we have built together, and everything I believe we can continue building in the years ahead." As they stood together in the awakening garden, the promise of spring surrounding them after the long, difficult winter, both literal and metaphorical, that had tested their bond so thoroughly, Cade felt a certainty settle over him that surpassed anything the mysterious pull of fate had first awakened within him months earlier in his crowded, silent throne room. Whatever challenges still lay ahead for Blackthorn and its people, he now faced them with a partner whose strength matched his own, whose compassion had reshaped his understanding of true leadership, and whose love, freely given rather than simply fated, had become the truest foundation his kingdom would ever need. The morning of the ceremony arrived bright and clear, the kind of early spring day that seemed to promise renewal after a long and difficult season. Blackthorn Castle had been transformed for the occasion, its great hall decorated with fresh flowers gathered from the castle gardens and surrounding countryside, a deliberate departure from the cold, imposing formality that had once characterized every gathering held within these walls. Alara stood in a private chamber, Grace fussing gently with the final details of her gown, while young Grace and Daniel watched with wide, excited eyes, dressed in their own finest clothes for the momentous occasion. "You look beautiful," young Grace said, admiration clear in her voice as she studied her older sister. Thank you, Ilara said, though her attention remained partly distracted, nervous energy building steadily as the ceremony's start drew closer. She thought of everything that had led to this moment. The chains that had first bound her wrists when she was dragged into Cade's throne room. The shocking sight of him kneeling before her. The painful revelation about her parents that had nearly shattered their fragile trust. The terror of her abduction and the fierce relief of rescue that followed. Every difficult step had led her here, to this moment, standing on the threshold of a future she could never have imagined for herself only months earlier. Meanwhile, in the great hall, Cade stood before the assembled crowd, nobles and common citizens gathered together in a way that would have been unthinkable under his father's rule, when such formal occasions had been reserved exclusively for the wealthy and powerful. Edmund stood nearby, along with Helen the Oracle, whose presence at the ceremony carried particular significance given her role in helping Cade understand the bond that had first brought him and Ilara together. "Are you ready?" Edmund asked quietly, noting the visible nervousness beneath Cade's carefully composed exterior. "I have faced armies with less uncertainty than I feel in this moment," Cade admitted, a rare, genuine smile crossing his features. "That seems a fitting measure of how significant this day truly is," Edmund observed. The great doors of the hall opened, and a hush fell over the assembled crowd as Ilara entered, her siblings walking proudly beside her. Cade felt his breath catch at the sight of her, every lingering doubt or uncertainty about the ceremony ahead dissolving completely as their eyes met across the crowded hall. As she made her way toward him, walking past nobles who had once whispered fearfully about the strange bond that had overtaken their king, past common citizens whose lives had been genuinely improved by the reforms she had helped inspire, Ilara felt the weight of the moment settle over her, not as a burden, but as a culmination of everything she had fought through to reach this point. When she finally reached Cade's side, he took her hands in his, the same gesture that had become so naturally comfortable between them over recent months, now performed before the entire assembled kingdom rather than in the privacy they had grown accustomed to sharing. "People of Blackthorn," Cade began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Many of you have wondered about the events that unfolded in this very hall many months ago, when I knelt before a woman who had done nothing but speak an honest truth I desperately needed to hear." A murmur passed through the crowd, memory of that shocking day still vivid for those who had witnessed it firsthand. "I will not pretend the bond that connects Ilara and myself is something I fully understand, even now," Cade continued. "But I have come to understand something perhaps more important than the mysterious forces that first drew us together. I have learned that true strength is not found in ruling through fear, as my father once taught me, but in having the courage to be honest, to be fair, and yes, even to kneel before what truly matters, without shame or hesitation." He turned to face Ilara directly, and then, deliberately, before his entire kingdom, lowered himself to one knee, though this time the gesture carried none of the confused, involuntary compulsion of that first moment months earlier. This kneeling was a choice, freely made, carrying the full weight of everything he had come to understand about genuine strength and genuine love. "Ilara Voss," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall, "you arrived in my life in chains, accused of a crime you did not commit, and yet you spoke truth to me when everyone else in this kingdom had learned only to speak fear. You have shown me a better way to rule, a better way to understand my own strength, and you have given me a love I never believed myself capable of receiving or deserving. Will you stand beside me, not simply as my fated mate, but as my queen, my equal partner in building the kind of kingdom our people truly deserve?" Tears streamed freely down Ilara's face as she looked down at him, remembering every difficult step of the journey that had brought them to this moment, every doubt overcome, every truth painfully but honestly confronted. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall despite the emotion coloring it. "I will stand beside you, freely and completely, for exactly the reasons you have named, and for the love that has grown between us, beyond anything fate alone could have determined." As Cade rose to his feet and drew her into an embrace, the assembled crowd erupted into genuine celebration, cheers and applause echoing through the great hall in a way that felt entirely different from the fearful silence that had once characterized every gathering held within these walls. Grace and Daniel cheered loudest among the crowd, joy radiating from both children as they watched their sister claim a happiness that had once seemed impossibly distant from their difficult circumstances. In the weeks and months that followed, Blackthorn continued its quiet transformation under their combined leadership, Cade's strength and decisiveness balanced by Alara's compassion and unwavering commitment to fairness. The kingdom that had once ruled through fear became known instead for its justice, its prosperity spreading gradually to even the most struggling villages within its borders. Victor Ashcomb's failed attempt to exploit their bond became, ultimately, a cautionary tale rather than a genuine threat to Blackthorn's stability. His territory eventually brought under careful, fair governance, following lengthy negotiations that Alara herself played a significant role in shaping, drawing on her own experience of hardship to ensure the terms reached were just rather than purely punitive. Helen the Oracle, watching these developments with quiet satisfaction, reflected often on how rare and precious the true bond truly was, how fortunate this particular pairing had proven to be, not simply for the two individuals connected by fate, but for an entire kingdom that had desperately needed exactly the kind of transformation their union had ultimately inspired. Years later, when their own children asked about the strange, wonderful story of how their parents had first met, Cade and Alara would tell it exactly as it happened, without embellishment or exaggeration. The chains, the insult spoken without fear, the shocking, involuntary moment when the most feared king in the land had knelt before a woman accused of nothing more than stealing bread to feed her hungry family. And they would tell their children, with the same conviction that had carried them through every difficult trial along their journey together, that true strength was never found in ruling through fear, but always, always, in having the courage to kneel before what truly mattered most. The kingdom of Blackthorn, once known throughout the land for its ruthless king and the fear he commanded, became instead a story told for generations to come, a story of transformation, of honest truth spoken without fear, and of a love that had proven, in the end, far stronger than any legend or any throne could ever claim to be.